John Locke revealed why most men are now slaves to feminine approval. Most men are slaves who don't even recognize their own chains. These words, inspired by John Locke's revolutionary thinking, expose a truth that many modern men are too uncomfortable to face. While Locke was addressing political tyranny in his time, his framework for understanding freedom and consent reveals something far more personal and pervasive today: the quiet submission of masculine identity to feminine approval. You likely believe you make your own choices. You imagine your ambitions, your style, your speech patterns, and your behavior flow naturally from some authentic inner self. Yet how much of what you consider natural has been carefully cultivated to secure female validation? Locke's concept of tacit consent, the idea that silence implies agreement, applies not just to governments but to the invisible social contract that modern men have unknowingly signed. Consider how often you modify your speech, checking yourself mid-sentence to ensure nothing you say might offend. Notice how you've been trained to soften your opinions, to present yourself as one of the good ones, a man who understands, who listens, who performs the emotional labor expected of him. These are not coincidences. They are adaptations to a social environment where male identity must be continuously negotiated through female gatekeepers. Locke argued that consent to authority must be informed and voluntary to be legitimate. Yet which man consciously chose this arrangement? Which boy growing up was told explicitly, "Your worth will be measured by how well you conform to standards set by women's comfort"? None were told, because the most effective prison is one where the inmates believe they're free. The educational system, entertainment media, and corporate policies have gradually shifted to favor traits traditionally associated with feminine approaches: consensus building over competition, emotional disclosure over stoic resilience, verbal processing over action-oriented problem-solving. This isn't a conspiracy, but an emergent property of our social evolution. As Locke would note, power doesn't require malicious intent to create dependency. What makes this situation uniquely difficult to address is that any man who questions it risks immediate dismissal through labels designed specifically to neutralize such resistance. The system's immune response is to pathologize dissent. Locke would recognize this as the hallmark of an authority that fears examination. Legitimate power welcomes scrutiny. Illegitimate power deflects it. But there's a deeper truth here that even Locke might hesitate to articulate. This arrangement damages both sexes. Women don't ultimately want men whose primary orientation is seeking female approval. They want men who embody an authentic masculine presence that complements rather than mirrors their own. The current dynamic creates men who are neither truly free nor truly attractive, performers of an identity rather than embodiments of one. John Locke's treatises on government and human understanding weren't simply political texts. They were profound explorations of what constitutes legitimate authority and the formation of personal identity. His conception of the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate written upon by experience, provides the perfect framework for understanding how modern masculinity has been inscribed with a fundamental orientation toward feminine validation. When Locke wrote of property rights, he was establishing the principle that a person owns what they create through their labor. Yet many men today have surrendered the ownership of their own identity. They labor not to create themselves, but to create a self that is acceptable to the feminine imperative. The fruit of their labor is not their own property, but a performance evaluated by external criteria. The psychological architecture of this phenomenon becomes clear when viewed through Locke's understanding of how ideas form associations in the mind. From earliest childhood, boys are taught that their natural impulses, their aggression, their physicality, their competitive drive, are problematic and require correction. Meanwhile, the behavior that earns praise is behavior that accommodates, that doesn't disturb, that fits within parameters defined largely by feminine comfort. This conditioning creates a powerful associative link. Male worth becomes inextricably tied to female approval. The reward mechanisms of the brain cement this connection until seeking feminine validation becomes an unconscious default. Like Pavlov's dogs, men have been conditioned to salivate at the bell of female affirmation and to fear the withdrawal of that affirmation more than almost anything else. Locke would identify this as a classic case of transferred authority. In political terms, he argued that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. But what happens when men consent to be governed not by their own values, but by the anticipated reactions of women? They become, in essence, colonial subjects within their own identities. The irony deepens when we recognize that Locke's conception of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, applies as much to psychological territory as to physical land. Many men have ceded the liberty of self-definition and the property rights to their own identity. They no longer own themselves. They have become psychological tenant farmers working land owned by others. Consider how this manifests in everyday interactions. A man in a group conversation instinctively checks women's faces for signs of approval or disapproval before continuing his thought. Another man apologizes preemptively before expressing an opinion that might create tension. These are not the behaviors of the psychologically self-sovereign. They are the habits of those who have internalized their subordinate status. Locke would be particularly troubled by how this arrangement violates his principle of equality. He believed all humans were created equal in their natural rights. Yet, the current social dynamic establishes female emotional comfort as hierarchically superior to male authenticity. This isn't equality, it's an inverted power structure disguised as progress. What would John Locke make of the modern social landscape, where the contract between the sexes has been fundamentally rewritten without explicit negotiation? He would likely identify it as a case study in how power transitions can occur through incremental shifts rather than revolutionary upheavals. The traditional social contract between men and women was explicit, if deeply flawed. Men provided protection and provision. Women offered care and reproduction. This arrangement, while rightly critiqued for its limitations on female autonomy, at least had the virtue of transparency. Both parties understood the terms of engagement. Today's arrangement is more insidious precisely because it maintains the expectation of male obligation while removing the clarity of what men receive in return. Modern men still feel the weight of traditional expectations to provide, to protect, to perform, while simultaneously being told these impulses represent problematic aspects of masculinity. They must be strong but not intimidating, confident but not domineering, protective but not controlling. The goalposts are mobile, and the rules shift depending on context. Locke's concept of the social contract emphasized the importance of mutual benefit and voluntary participation. Yet many men now find themselves in an arrangement they never consciously entered, operating under rules they never agreed to, and receiving diminishing returns for their compliance. This is precisely the kind of governance Locke argued people have the right to reform or replace. The philosopher would be particularly troubled by how this new contract undermines what he considered essential to human dignity, agency, and autonomy. A man whose internal compass is calibrated to female approval rather than his own values lacks true self-determination. He is, in Locke's framework, living in a state of voluntary servitude, the most pernicious kind because it masquerades as freedom. What makes this situation uniquely modern is that it occurs against a backdrop of unprecedented material comfort and nominal equality. Unlike the political tyrannies Locke witnessed, this subjugation doesn't announce itself with swords or chains. It arrives bearing gifts of social acceptance and the promise of romantic connection. It offers men a bargain. Surrender your authentic self, and we will protect you from the most painful male experience: rejection and isolation. Most insidiously, this arrangement exploits what Locke recognized as the human preference for security over liberty when the two appear to conflict. Men accept psychological subjugation because the alternative, standing firmly in their authentic, Masculinity without seeking approval feels dangerous and uncertain. The known discomfort of inauthenticity is preferable to the unknown risks of true self-ownership. Locke would likely observe that no sustainable social contract can function when one party bears disproportionate obligations, while the other holds disproportionate power to define the terms. Eventually, such systems generate their own resistance. We see this emerging in various male communities online, some healthy, many deeply problematic, but all responding to the same perceived contractual imbalance. John Locke's most enduring contribution to human thought may be his insistence that legitimate authority must be justified, rather than merely accepted. Applied to the modern male condition, this principle offers a roadmap to authentic liberation, not a regression to outdated patriarchal norms, but a progression toward genuine self-ownership. The first step on this path is consciousness. Locke emphasized that freedom begins with awareness of one's condition. Most men operate on autopilot, unconsciously orienting themselves toward female approval without recognizing this pattern. Real change begins when a man asks himself, "Would I make this choice, use these words, hold this opinion, if I weren't concerned with how women will perceive me?" This question, asked honestly, often reveals the extent of the conditioning. Locke's concept of natural rights provides the philosophical foundation for what comes next. If each person has an inherent right to self-determination, then men have not just the right, but the responsibility to reclaim authority over their own identity. This doesn't mean disregarding others' perspectives or comfort. It means ensuring that these considerations inform, rather than dictate one's choices. The practical application of this philosophy requires men to establish clear internal boundaries, to distinguish between respectful accommodation of others and unhealthy subordination of self. Locke would frame this as the difference between legitimate governance, which protects natural rights, and tyranny, which violates them. In personal terms, it means developing the discernment to recognize when adaptation to social expectations crosses into self-betrayal. This path is neither easy nor straightforward. The man who begins to withdraw his dependency on female validation will face resistance, both external and internal. Socially, he may be labeled problematic or regressive. Internally, he will confront the discomfort of operating without the familiar guideposts of approval and acceptance. This discomfort is exactly what Locke described as the transition from subjugation to liberty, a necessary passage through uncertainty toward authentic selfhood. What makes this journey worthwhile is what awaits on the other side, not a return to domination, but an arrival at genuine partnership. Locke's ideal government existed to protect natural rights while allowing citizens maximum freedom within those parameters. Similarly, the healthiest male-female dynamics emerge when both parties retain their authentic nature while voluntarily accommodating each other from a position of self-sovereignty. The ultimate irony, which Locke would appreciate, is that men who successfully liberate themselves from seeking female approval often become more genuinely attractive to women. Authentic masculinity, self-possessed, principled, and secure enough to engage without seeking validation, creates a magnetic presence that performance cannot replicate. Women respond not to men who mirror their priorities, but to men who complement them with a distinct masculine energy. This is the transformation that awaits on the other side of the psychological revolution Locke's principles invite. It offers not a retreat from connection, but a more profound basis for it. Relationships between self-sovereign individuals, rather than between performers and evaluators. In this light, reclaiming masculine authenticity becomes not a rejection of progress, but its fulfillment. The creation of a social contract truly based on mutual respect between equals, rather than the subtle dominance of one perspective over another.